Hello. This presentation was first delivered at the 2018 Civil Air Patrol National Conference in Anaheim, California, for the purpose of marking the 70th anniversary of CAP's first participation in what became known as the International Air Cadet Exchange, or IACE. As with much of CAP's history, we have but fragments to tell our story. Thankfully, CAP's first International Cadet Exchange experience can be told through two scrapbooks, one from the ranking escort, Major Lewis A. Edwards, and another from a cadet, Cadet Franklin R. Meyer. Informative and humorous, these two scrapbooks capture 2 weeks of adventure, friendship, and possible youthful romance among neighbors and allies. First, a little background to understand how CAP's participation in IACE came into being. IACE itself traces its origins to a meeting between representatives of the United Kingdom Air Training Corps and the Air Cadet League of Canada in Montreal on April 11, 1946. The meeting focused on initiating a proposal for the formal exchange of cadets. Now, a polio outbreak in Canada curtailed the exchange in 1946, but the following year an exchange of 46 cadets and 2 escort officers commenced between Canada and the United Kingdom. On November 20, 1947, CAP's national commander, then Brigadier General Lucas V. Bow, seen here on the right, received a letter from Mr. George M. Ross, Managing Director of the Air Cadet League. Ross invited Bow and his staff to meet in Ottawa in early February of 1948 to discuss, quote, matters pertaining to the recruiting and the training of Civil Air Patrol cadets and Canadian Air Cadets, their counterpart in the United Kingdom, and the various dominions. In addition, it was hoped that the various participating countries would be able to enter into discussions relative to the possibility of exchanging Air Cadets and CAP cadets. With permission from the United States Air Force, Bow and members of his staff attended the Air Cadet League's annual meeting, and both parties initiated plans for a cadet exchange later that year. Details of the plans emerged in April 1948. On the 9th, the Air Cadet League announced that CAP reached agreement to exchange cadets with Canada. At CAP's third annual congressional dinner on May 26th, recently promoted Major General Bow addressed hundreds of members of Congress, approximately 75 United States Air Force generals, and several senior Canadian officials. He announced the beginning of, quote, a cadet activity which I believe to be one of the finest the Civil Air Patrol has ever sponsored. Bow declared that 24 American CAP cadets would be exchanged with 24 Canadian cadets, while an additional 40 Canadian cadets would compete against a like number of CAP cadets in an international drill competition in New York City on August 7th. At Idlewild International Airport on that Saturday, the Canadian cadets won the inaugural Major General Lucas V. Bow International Challenge Trophy in front of a crowd of approximately 185,000. Prior to Bow's address, CAP National Headquarters commenced locating the cadets who would be sent on the exchange. In early May, National Headquarters at Bolling Air Force Base, Washington, D.C., instructed wing commanders to submit one name for consideration to be one of the 24 cadets selected for the exchange in Canada. By early July, National Headquarters made its selections. The young men selected are listed here on the slide. To oversee the cadets and coordinate with Canadian authorities, CAP National Headquarters selected 2 men, CAP Major Lewis A. Edwards of Detroit, Michigan, the wing adjutant, and Air Force Captain Emerson L. Armstrong of Des Moines, then the Iowa Wing Air Force CAP Liaison Officer. On July 12th, Cadet Franklin R. Meyer of Cheshire, Connecticut received a congratulatory letter from the National Commander, which you can see here on the right. Bow informed Meyer that, quote, you have been chosen to represent your country, the United States Air Force, and Civil Air Patrol on a tour of Canada as part of an exchange program with Royal Canadian Air Cadets this summer. Bow listed the tour dates from July 28th to August 16th, with baggage requirements of 40 pounds, ideally in one Air Force B-4 bag and one small bag for personal effects. Cadet Meyer and his 23 young colleagues were ordered to pack 2 summer uniforms, the khaki Class A with garrison cap, a jacket for evenings, extra pair of shoes and an extra cap, plus a good supply of shirts, socks, underwear, swimming trunks, toothbrush, towels, and toilet soap. For any remaining space, cadets could bring a camera and a good supply of film, as well as money for personal spending. The itinerary for the CAP group changed slightly over the course of the exchange, but the following is a somewhat detailed reconstruction of the journey of the American ambassadors. Both the American and Canadian cadet bodies were organized into two groups. 12 cadets from the eastern states, designated the Eastern Group, assembled between July 28-29th at Selfridge Air Force Base, Detroit, Michigan, under the supervision of Edwards. The cadets from the western states, representing the Western Group, met at Lowry Air Force Base, Denver, Colorado, under the supervision of Armstrong. The bases are marked on the slide before you with stars, and the Eastern-Western Group cadets are color-coded according to their respective wings. Now, the visit for the CAP group overall can be summarized as seen here on the slide. Here is a map outlining the journeys of the two groups prior to meeting up. As you can see, the Eastern Group's journey covered practically the entire expanse of Canada. The Royal Canadian Air Cadet selectees, like their American counterparts, came from across the nation and represented the best cadets in the land. While I unfortunately do not have their photographs, their names, to the best of my ability, are depicted here before you. In terms of the visit, the Royal Canadian Air Cadet Itinerary differed from the Americans in that both parties started together, then split into Eastern and Western parties, before meeting again on their return to Canada. Their itinerary is listed on the slide here. Now at this point, I must admit the frustrating element. Civil Air Patrol does not have any primary records from the cadets of the Western Group, beyond a few brief summary reports. To the best of my ability, their experience can be outlined as follows. The cadets first met at Lowry Air Force Base on July 29th, boarded a U.S. Air Force C-47 Skytrain transport, and flew to Great Falls, Montana. After clearing customs, the plane flew on to Calgary, Alberta, on July 30th, where the American cadets met 12 Royal Canadian Air Cadets. After leaving Calgary on July 31st, the CAP cadets flew to Royal Canadian Air Force Base Station Sea Island, Vancouver, British Columbia, where the Americans were guests at a dinner and graduation ceremony of Royal Canadian Air Cadets from a flying training course. On August 1st, the Western Group left Station Sea Island in a Royal Canadian Air Force Avro Lancaster bomber and flew to Victoria, British Columbia to meet up with the Eastern Group at Patricia Bay Air Cadet Camp. Thankfully, the scrapbooks of Edwards and Meyer are detailed enough to allow me to walk you through the experiences of the Eastern Group through their photographs and surviving documents. Now, the Eastern Group flew in a U.S. Air Force C-47 transport to Royal Canadian Air Force Station Rockcliffe, Ottawa, in Ontario, on July 30th for a meeting of 12 Canadian Air Cadets on their way south to tour the United States. On the flight to Ottawa, the American cadets played cards, wrote letters, slept, or enjoyed the scenery out of the windows. Arriving early, the C-47 circled for about 30 minutes until the Canadian representatives were ready, promptly at 11 a.m. Precisely at that hour, the C-47 landed, taxied into position, and came to a complete stop by a formation of 12 Royal Canadian Air Cadets under the command of Flight Lieutenant L.W.C. Limpert. Edwards, U.S. Air Force Major James S. Abrams, and the 12 CAP cadets exited the aircraft and marched in formation into position facing the Canadian cadets. As the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Band sounded the General's March, Edwards and Abrams marched to position between the lines of cadets. As the cadets stood at attention, they received a personal inspection by Royal Canadian Air Force Air Vice Marshal Charles R. Sleman. Afterwards, he introduced the Americans to Mr. C. Douglas Taylor, Honorary President of the Air Cadet League of Canada, who welcomed the American cadets. Following his address, all cadets exchanged greetings and the formalities concluded with friendly chatter. Remarked Edwards, quote, "The ceremony of welcome was most colorful and was extremely well done. The Canadian Air Cadets were immaculate in dress, in perfect formation, and sharp as a razor, and the CAP were also something to see." Seen here is Cadet Meyer, shaking hands with Warrant Officer Class II Earl Barr of Toronto. On the right, from left across, is Air Vice Marshal Sleman, Major Edwards, Mr. Taylor, and Major Abrams. From the flight line, the cadets met with press and toured a static display of Royal Canadian Air Force aircraft. They received a luncheon tendered by Chief of the Air Staff, Air Marshal Wilfred A. Curtis, who gave a welcoming address to all assembled. Following luncheon, the cadets were driven to Ottawa with an escort by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as well as the Ottawa Police. The party first headed for a tour of the Parliament buildings before a meeting with American Ambassador Ray Atherton at the embassy for an official welcome. Afterwards, the party toured the French portion of Ottawa and drove into the Gatineau Valley to visit the summer estate of Mr. George Ross, Managing Director of the Air Cadet League of Canada, for a swimming party. Cadet Carl Stark from Minnesota Wing managed to swim across the Gatineau River and back, greatly impressing Air Vice Marshal Arthur L. James. After a dinner buffet and slideshow of the previous year's cadet exchange between Canada and the United Kingdom, James's 14-year-old daughter, Sandra, hosted a dance for the cadets and presented each American cadet, as well as their escort officers, with a small Air Cadet League of Canada pin, seen here on the left. I direct your attention to the yellow arrow on the one cadet's tie. Edwards secured official sanction by Ross, and shortly thereafter received permission from CAP National Headquarters for these small pins to become an official uniform item. The CAP cadets thereafter wore the pins half an inch below the knot of the necktie for the remainder of the exchange. The next day, the CAP cadets bid their Canadian counterparts a fond farewell as they departed for the United States with Major Abrams. The CAP cadets and Edwards then boarded a Royal Canadian Air Force C-47 Dakota transport and left Royal Canadian Air Force Station Rockcliffe with the addition of Flight Lieutenant Ainsley G. Dagg, Mr. Ross, and a gift of 10 cartons of cigarettes for the cadets from the United States Embassy. The entire party had a long day ahead, bound for Fort William, Winnipeg, Lethbridge, and lastly, Vancouver. Rough weather made the initial part of the trip stomach-churning for the cadets before the air smoothed and the aircraft arrived in Ontario for a tour of Fort William and Port Arthur, together with a lunch at Chippewa Park on the shore of Lake Superior. After lunch, the cadets visited a zoo at the park and watched their Canadian Air Cadet colleagues feed a 500-pound black bear by hand before giving it a try themselves. That afternoon, with thunderstorms stirring, the cadets flew on to Winnipeg. After an uneventful flight, the cadets disembarked and saw a captured German rocket plane and one of the Royal Canadian Air Force's new de Havilland Vampire jet fighters. The next morning, August 1st, they flew from Winnipeg and headed to Lethbridge. After a brief 2-hour stay, the group took off for Vancouver and Patricia Bay. At 12,000 feet altitude, the American cadets gazed in wonder at the Canadian Rockies and clicked away at their cameras. That afternoon, the plane landed at Royal Canadian Air Force Station Sea Island, Vancouver, and then departed for Royal Canadian Air Force Station Patricia Bay, Victoria, in British Columbia. At Patricia Bay, the Eastern and Western CAP cadet groups met for the first time on August 1st. They together received a warm welcome, and the cadets made their home in the Royal Canadian Air Force's Patricia Bay Air Cadet Camp. After freshening up after arrival, the Canadian hosts treated the Americans to a 2-hour ride on a motor torpedo boat, or MTB, which is akin to an American PT boat. Recalled Meyer, quote, "None of us had ever ridden on a PT boat before, and it was quite an experience. They travel at 45 miles an hour." The following day, Edwards and Armstrong established a Cadet Officer of the Day system for every cadet to lead and oversee their peers. The senior officers were helped in turn by their Canadian escort, Royal Canadian Air Force Sergeant Major Robert W. Shipperbottom, who billeted with the cadets. The morning of August 2nd, everyone left the station and arrived at a naval jetty at what is today's Canadian Forces Base Esquimalt to board and inspect the Minotaur-class light cruiser His Majesty's Canadian Service Ontario at the courtesy of the Royal Canadian Navy, Captain J.S. Hibbard. For 2 hours, members of the ship's company showed the cadets the vessel, quote, from stem to stern and bridge to boilers. After departing the cruiser, the Gyro Club of Victoria hosted the cadets at Lougheed's Banquet Hall for luncheon before the party proceeded to the Parliament buildings. After a tour of these facilities, the cadets assembled outside of the Crystal Garden and enjoyed a swim in the pool, which was filled with heated, chlorinated seawater. That evening, the Victoria Yacht Club on Arbutus Bay hosted a dinner and a dance for the CAP contingent. Quote, "This was our first surprise," wrote Meyer. for it was at this dinner that 24 pretty Victoria girls were our companions for the evening. We all enjoyed the evening. On August 3rd, commenced with a voyage on water. Arriving at the Canadian Pacific Railway dock, the American cadets boarded the passenger liner SS Princess Mary for a 5-hour journey around Vancouver Island and through the Gulf Islands with callings at James Island and Port Washington. After several hours cruising, the liner arrived at Ganges Harbor on Salt Spring Island for an hour of exploring by the cadets. Later in the afternoon, the Americans boarded a bus and were driven to a dock at Fulford to be ferried back to Swartz Bay, before taking yet another bus back to Victoria for a banquet at the Douglas Hotel as guests of the Mayor of Victoria, His Worship Mayor P.E. George. As that evening would be the cadets' last in Patricia Bay, they all chipped in to purchase a new wallet and place $7 in it as a thank you gift for Sergeant Major Shipperbottom. On August 4th, the cadets bid farewell to Patricia Bay. That morning they boarded an MTB and roared off on the water to the Imperial Cannery at Stevenston. The American delegation received a thorough tour of the salmon cannery, and Meyer wrote a rather lengthy description of this cannery. Quote, "The reception at the cannery was something none of us had ever seen or ever will be seen again by us. We had a lunch of baked, fried, boiled, broiled, and salmon cheese and sauce made of salmon. We also had shrimp cocktail. On this tour of the cannery, we watched the fish being taken off the boats and watched the fish being cut up, ground, washed, packed, and cooked. From there, the cans of processed salmon were packed either for storage or shipment. The cannery didn't have a very pleasant odor." After the cannery visit and a change of uniform, Air Vice Marshal Kenneth G. Nairn received the Americans at his estate for a garden party. At the party, a number of citizens of Vancouver attended along with, quote, pretty girls for the cadets. All the cadets and their American officers received a sweater from the Air Cadet League of Canada featuring a red totem pole with red wings on the shoulders, all on a gray background. Cadet Meyer can be seen wearing his here on the right. In the evening, the senior guests and their daughters took the cadets home for dinner and entertainment before the Americans returned to barracks at Royal Canadian Air Force Station Sea Island, just outside of Vancouver. Suffice to say, even more adventure lay in store. On the morning of August 5th, 2 Royal Canadian Air Force C-47 Dakotas flew the CAP contingent 300 miles to Prince George. Arriving around noon, the Prince George Board of Trade and the Rotary Club received everyone for luncheon. After the meal, the Americans drove 50 miles north to Davie Lake Camp of the Campbell Mannix Construction Company on the Alcan Highway, where the cadets would spend the night. The camp was a bit primitive. Quote, "It had all the comforts of 1850, mused Meyer. But the lake offered tremendous trout fishing, despite the rain. Although the fishing was out of season, the local game warden was present and made an exception for the American guests. That evening, professional singer Ingrid Anderson led camp songs. The remoteness of the camp cannot be understated. The next morning around 5 a.m., the howls of wolves startled the cadets awake, followed by a bear that knocked over the garbage cans, rummaging for food. Despite the visit of the local wildlife, the cadets enjoyed a workers' breakfast of ham, eggs, sausage, milk, pancakes, and potatoes, then drove back to Prince George for lunch, courtesy of the Rotary Club, at the Prince George Hotel. The afternoon of August 6th, the cadets flew back to Vancouver and attended an intercity box lacrosse league game between the Burrards and the Salmon Bellies at the Vancouver Forum. Lacrosse came as a shock to the Americans. Quote, "This game is faster and rougher than American hockey," observed Meyer. The tour took a slight breather on the weekend of August 7th and 8th. On Saturday, the cadets voluntarily practiced drilling and looking over various Royal Canadian Air Force aircraft. Later in the afternoon, the Royal Vancouver Yacht Club hosted the cadets at their midsummer regatta for sailing and swimming. During the regatta, the cadets had a slight accident or two with the boats, and their hosts invited them to participate in a race which a few of the Americans attempted, with good fun for all. That evening, the Yacht Club hosted a dinner and dance with most of the young ladies as dance partners for the Americans. Meyer described the night as one of the, quote, "most enjoyable days of the trip in most of our eyes," and he mentioned meeting University of British Columbia co-ed Miss Elizabeth Taylor. In Meyer's own words, "Every one of us regretted that we had to return to the base at midnight. However, we saw our dates later in the week." Curiously, Edwards and Armstrong apparently had stayed back at the barracks leaving the cadets to enjoy the festivities to themselves. Sunday, August 9th, was not much different. With the morning free, Armstrong flew the eastern group of cadets in turn aloft in a North American T-6 Texan, although in this case, a Royal Canadian Air Force T-6 Harvard. Other cadets attended church services. One cadet, William Jeffries of the National Capital Wing, was late for the morning formation, and thereafter the other 23 cadets, in Edwards' own words, quote, took turns at drilling him bow-legged. That afternoon, the CAP contingent headed to the estate of retired Major and Mrs. August Taylor in Vancouver. Taylor, an executive of the Standard Oil Company of Canada, welcomed the Americans with another 24 young ladies, and after the swimming party concluded, all the cadets received permission to go to the various girls' homes for the evenings, on invitation, provided the cadets could make the trip back to base safely. On this evening, Meyer met and chatted with Miss Tammy Rice. Bright and early on August 10th, the cadets boarded a Catalina flying boat and a Canadian Norden Nushman bush plane and flew to Sproat Lake to witness logging operations. Everyone watched awestruck as the lumberjacks felled massive trees in minutes that were then hauled out of the forest on a cable trolley to a river before floating to lumber mills to be turned into matches and paper pulp. Returning by flying boat to Vancouver in the afternoon, the cadets had a free night. Cadets Meyer and Rutigliano acquired dates and went to the Vancouver Forum to hear a performance by Charlie Barnett and his orchestra. The next day, the cadets enjoyed a free morning in Vancouver. Meyer took a stroll through Stanley Park with Miss Taylor. And in the afternoon, the Americans flew back to the forest to witness more logging before heading on to Paisley Island, owned by Air Commodore Alan Duncan Bell Irving, for fishing, swimming, and dinner. On the morning of August 11th, the cadets flew to Powell River as guests of the Powell River Company. There, the cadets watched logs brought in from a boom and transformed into pulp at a nearby mill. As Edwards later reported, quote, the sight of the huge logs being stripped of bark by water pressure, sawed to small sizes and reduced to chips, pulverized, and then finally floated into one end of a machine as a soupy liquid, and coming out the other end as huge rolls of newspaper print, was better than the best magician's show. Small yachts moved the cadets farther up the Powell River for salmon fishing, albeit unsuccessful, a hearty lunch, and then swimming before returning via flying boat to Royal Canadian Air Force Station Sea Island in the evening. On Thursday the 12th, the morning festivities included observing the weekly inspection of the personnel at Sea Island, an examination of the air-sea rescue equipment, and a walkthrough of a Vampire jet fighter. The city of Vancouver hosted a lunch at Stanley Park, and Acting Mayor Jonathan D. Cornett led a city tour. In the evening, everyone attended the city's Theater Under the Stars and witnessed a performance of the play The Great Waltz about Johann Strauss. Edwards purchased extra tickets to allow the cadets to bring along their Vancouver dates. The cadets again received permission to remain out as long as they desired. Meyer spent his evening with Miss Rice, and together they joined Cadets Bryant, Rutigliano, and O'Keefe, with their respective dates, at the home of Cadet Bryant's date. The young Americans did not return to base until 5 a.m. the next day. As Meyer recorded ever so succinctly, "We enjoyed ourselves, too." It is not clear when the cadets actually slept, but that Friday, August 13th, would be the last in Vancouver. We were all present the next morning, remembered Meyer in his official history, to attend a farewell Coke party hosted at the home of Miss William Farrell, where the Americans had to bid goodbye to their young Canadian hostesses. That day, the skies opened up with rain so hard that the cadets remained at Sea Island Station all day. At 7 a.m. the following morning, the cadets took off for Calgary and flew above 15,000 feet on oxygen over the Rockies in order to avoid a bad storm front. Landing at Royal Canadian Air Force Station Lincoln Park, the cadets boarded a bus for Banff for a quick visit before traveling to Calgary for a concluding grain ceremony and banquet at Station Lincoln Park. At the banquet that evening, Beau and other CAP dignitaries flew in to join the commander of the Royal Canadian Air Cadets, Air Vice Marshal Kenneth M. Guthrie, as well as other Air Cadet League dignitaries. All 24 American and all 24 Canadian cadets met and swapped stories. The CAP cadets presented the Canadian cadets with CAP lapel insignia, sang songs, and shared in the joy of the exchange. Guthrie presented a silver ashtray, and Beau presented a traveler's clock to each of the cadets. After the formalities, the American and Canadian cadets returned to the barracks and commenced exchanging additional articles of clothing, and Insignia. But alas, all good things had to end. The morning of August 15th, wrote Meyer, quote, was the saddest morning of the tour, because the two CAP groups had to return to the States. For Edwards, quote, takeoff from Calgary was quite an emotional tug on all of us, as it meant not only leaving our many new Canadian friends, but also the separation of the cadets again into Eastern and Western groups. As the station Lincoln Park Band performed for the takeoff for the Royal Canadian Air Cadets, and as the CAP Eastern Group taxied for takeoff back to Selfridge Air Force Base, the CAP Western Group, destined for Lowry Air Force Base, stood in formation and rendered them a snappy salute. The Eastern Group first arrived in Great Falls, Montana to clear customs, and they shared lunch with the Montana wing before arriving in Minneapolis for dinner that evening. The next afternoon, August 16th, the group arrived back at Selfridge Air Force Base, and the cadets disbanded to return home to their local squadrons. In the immediate aftermath of the exchange, Edwards submitted a concluding letter to CAP National Headquarters. He reported to General Bowe how, quote, as a whole, the trip was a huge success, though the pace was so rapid that many of our cadets became satiated. They were too tired to really grasp in full the wonder of all we were shown. Edwards noted how, quote, throughout the trip we found the Canadians extremely cordial and gracious hosts. They simply couldn't do enough for us. On a deeper level, Edwards recognized that Canadians exhibited a, quote, universal acceptance of aviation in Canada as a vitally necessary part of their daily lives, and the great enthusiasm of their civilians in all walks of life for the movement sponsored by the Air Cadet League of Canada. Edwards further acknowledged that, quote, we of the CAP have a man-sized job on our hands if we are to arouse a similar enthusiasm here. Together with his letter, Edwards also provided a list of 18 suggestions for future CAP cadet exchanges. Many of the recommendations revolved around uniforms. First on the list, National Headquarters should send each cadet chosen a copy of correct uniform and insignia regulations. The cadets should have 4 sets of slacks and shirts, purchase a pair of plain dress Oxfords for best wear, bring a pair of sunglasses, have name badges, and be urged to take regulation military uniform bags for easier stowage aboard aircraft. Regarding the selected cadets, Edwards had recommended that, quote, cadets chosen for the tour should have an excellent rating in drill, military courtesy, and discipline. They should be erect in posture, not overweight, and should be of the average appearance of a 17-year-old lad. He added, quote, social graces should also be considered inasmuch as a goodly portion of the program consists of social activity in the company of the very finest people. Appropriately enough, Edwards had kept notes on all 24 cadets. He reported to Bowe that overall, quote, conduct throughout the trip on the part of the cadets was excellent, with one exception, the latter being Cadet William Jeffries of National Capital Wing, who persistently reported late for mess and formations, and who exhibited a, quote, superior attitude toward the other cadets and was not too well liked. For the cadets overall, Cadet Stark received the greatest number of compliments on his appearance and military bearing, while Cadets Phelps, Ottinger, O'Keefe, and Dernan received compliments as well. In Edwards' scrapbook, he observed how Cadet Holstein of Ohio was, quote, inclined to be a loudmouth. Its untidy and wrinkled uniform most of the time. Untidy room also at Sea Island Base. Got along better after a talk. Gained 26 pounds and fell in love on the trip. In comparison, Cadet Reed of Indiana was, quote, fine boy, pilot, neat, military, cooperative, on the ball, all the time. Additional administrative aspects of Edwards' work included gathering information to help with future exchanges and thanking the Canadian hosts. The cadets in turn were provided names and addresses of all the hosts to thank for their hospitality. All of the young hostesses received a bouquet of flowers and a thank you card. Various gifts were given to some of the senior military and Air Cadet League officials with whom Edwards became acquainted with, and he also sent every host or hostess a personal letter. Cost-wise, Major Robert A. Trennert at CAP National Headquarters had issued Edwards $500 for the tour. In addition to purchasing films, Edwards bought extra insignia, collar stays, and name tags for the cadets, as well as an iron to help keep uniforms presentable. Food, taxi fare, and small amounts of spending money for the cadets made up a final expenditure of $422.21. Edwards also distributed 24 questionnaires to the American cadets, and he received 22 responses, from which he compiled the data for national headquarters. The cadets gained an average of 6 pounds and spent around $29 each on the exchange. Of the 3 items on the tour that appealed most to the cadets, the answers ran the gamut with some obvious crowd favorites. Fishing and the Canadian ladies, or as one cadet wrote, the excellent selection of feminine pulchritude, were frequently listed. The dances, cruises, tour of the cruiser Ontario, and visiting the cannery and paper mill were also mentioned. In offering suggestions for helping the Air Cadet League plan the 1949 tour, cadets predominantly asked for more free time to handle a variety of tasks. One requested less rich food at the banquets, more opportunity to interact with, quote, people of our own standing, less time with women, and more recreation. On a technical level, one cadet requested the carrying of parachutes in Canadian aircraft if the American cadets were going to be aboard. To help CAP improve its portion of the tour, the American cadets recommended advising those from southern states to bring more warm clothing, issue cadets with fatigues and heavy shoes, practice drill as a team, and the issuance of uniforms for the tour to ensure uniformity in appearance. One recommended that, quote, greater care should be taken in the selection of American cadets, particularly as to table manners, tact, and intelligence. The accent in this tour seemed to be on a rather thin veneer of glamour, to the almost complete exclusion of other qualities. Now, regarding the fate of the 1948 CAP contingent, only fragmentary information has been located. Edwards would rise to become the 3rd Michigan Wing Commander, serving from 1951 to 1955, and then as Great Lakes Region Commander from 1957 to 1958. He died in 1971. Emerson stayed in the Air Force and retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1963. He passed away in 2004. Cadet Franklin R. Meyer served as a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army Reserve, earned a degree in mechanical engineering from Purdue University, and made his career as an engineer with Sikorsky Aircraft. Cadet Merwin O. Reed also graduated from Purdue with an undergraduate and graduate degree in forestry, serving as a civil servant with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the United States Forest Service. Unfortunately, I have been unable to locate the whereabouts for 11 of Meyer's peers. For the other 12 cadets, 8 are deceased and 4 appear to still be with us. I hope to find them at some point to obtain more information about their exchange experience. For those located that have gone west, here are a few postscript details. Cadet George V. Crater served with the United States Army in the Korean War and passed away in 1996. Cadet Harry Nicholas graduated from the University of Wyoming and then spent a career with the Union Pacific Railroad as a foreman electrician at the Roundhouse. He died in 2015. Cadet Elwood A. Phelps also served in the Korean War, albeit with the United States Air Force, and passed away in 1969. Cadet George A. Bradfoot, Jr. would serve in the United States Air Force. After studying electrical engineering at the universities of Minnesota and Tennessee, he worked for Sperry Rand and the National Institutes of Health before passing in 2015. Cadet Dushan Simonia, who died in 2015, served in the United States Air Force and the United States Army as a cartographer, ending his time with the Department of Defense at the Defense Mapping Agency Aerospace Center, where he rose to be acting director. Cadet Michael H. O'Keefe became a prominent lawyer and politician in Louisiana, culminating in the presidency of the Louisiana State Senate in 1976. He was convicted in 1983 of mail fraud and obstruction of justice before receiving a pardon in 1986. After regaining his legal license in 1989, he was permanently disbarred in 2000 for misconduct, a year after he was sentenced in 1999 to 19.5 years in prison for theft. He was released from federal custody in 2016. Far more laudable is the career of Cadet Oscar L. Schuler. He was drafted into the Army in 1953 and rose through the enlisted ranks before receiving a commission. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1977 after 2 combat tours in the Vietnam War, for which he received multiple Distinguished Flying Crosses, Bronze Stars, and Air Medals. He passed away in 2011. The 1948 exchange proved a great success. General Bowe officially commended Edwards for a, quote, an outstanding job in carrying out all the details necessary to make such a program a success. In a personal letter of September 8, 1948, George M. Ross wrote to Edwards, congratulating him on his selection as the accompanying officer. Quote, "It was obvious to us from the time you arrived that you not only enjoyed the full confidence of the cadets, but created a fine impression with everyone you met. Therefore, we can truly say you played a big part in a very big enterprise." In terms of the overall exchange, Ross remarked how, quote, "I frankly do not think we could have hoped for a finer result, especially for the initial operation." And the results indeed proved quite fine. In 1949, the exchange expanded with American CAP cadets being exchanged with their counterparts in Canada, France, Great Britain, and Switzerland. The exchange continued to expand thereafter, and the International Air Cadet Exchange as we know it today emerged by the 1950s. Thank you all for watching, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions you have in the comments section below.